Good afternoon. I'm Vita Palladino, and I am the director of the Howard Gotlieb Archival Research Center at Boston University. We're located in the library next door. If you choose, at some point, you can see our extended exhibition area on the first floor after you leave this building. It is a momentous occasion, and I want to say it is a miracle that this is happening here in this moment, to gather such distinguished poets and artists in this town. And they come from all over America. They've come from many academic institutions, which names we will not mention. Anybody got cell phones? You can turn them off now. There's a person in this room who had this idea. This particular person has changed poetry in her tenure as poetry editor of The New Yorker. She is one of the best networkers of people I have seen in many, many years. She has helped the careers of poets. She has actually changed the face of poetry in how it gets published. It's not easy for the path of a poet to find publishers. It's always challenging. And Alice Quinn has made an enormous difference in this area. This was her idea. I'm just merely a slave to this idea. Totally committed. And she really deserves a round of applause for all the ways she's affected our life. So she was poetry editor for 20 years. From 1987 to 2001, she was also a fiction editor and an editor of memoirs, profiles, book reviews, and a variety of critics' choice pieces at The New Yorker. Prior to that, she worked at Alfred A. Knopf publishing fiction biographies, works of cultural history, and books on American folk art while editing Knopf's poetry series. She is also an adjunct professor at the Creative Writing Program at Columbia University. She has lectured on poetry and given talks on publishing at many colleges and cultural institutions. In 2007, Alice was the editor of Edgar Allan Poe and the Jukebox, Uncollected Poems, Drafts, and Fragments, featured nearly 120 unpublished poems of Elizabeth Bishop. Ladies and gentlemen, Alice Quinn.
Thank you, Vita. I don't know where you found out all that information. Thank you so much. It's been a joy for me to work with Vita in bringing these events to Boston University. And all I have to say is that I can't thank the poets enough for taking part. And we have a sign-up sheet for the Poetry Society of America, and we have a raffle. If you write your name and address and pop it in the bowl, at the end of the week, we're going to raffle off a beautiful broadside of a poem signed by Rita Dove, former U.S. Poet Laureate. So I hope you'll come to the reading tonight, and thank you so much for coming this afternoon. And Vita, thank you for making it all happen.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dante Michaud, and I'm the afternoon's moderator. Can you hear me? No?
Sort of. Get a mic.
It's on. Yeah? Good. Okay, great. So in the interest of time, I'll just go over the format of today's panel. The poets will not be making any opening statements. Instead, I will introduce them with lines from their poems, and we will go directly into a conversation that will last about an hour, and at the end of that hour, we will have about a half an hour for questions from the audience. So, thank you all for coming. After the roiling Atlantic, the black Atlantic, black and mucilaginous, after skin to skin in the hold and the picked handcuff locks after the mutiny. Elizabeth Alexander.
Louder.
All right, I don't think it goes up any farther.
I think you need to get it closer to you, though.
All right. Is that better?
Yeah.
A color like rust is in me. I can't get rid of it. It rises after I brush my teeth, a taste like iron. Toy Derricott. You'll never sleep tonight. Trains will betray you. Cars confess their destinations, whether you like it or not. Cornelius Eady. How do you like the weather, girls? All in together, girls. January, February, March, April. The jump ropes portentous looming, their great aching love blooming. Major Jackson. I'm standing here in unpolished shoes and faded jeans, sweating my manly sweat. Inside my skin, loving you. I am this space my body believes in. Yusef Komunyaku. They say, recovering, lips suffering the glass, and they say, dig, dig, rise from tough root. To know is to know why, or was. Don Lundy Martin. Is this how you're going to live now? Sang the voice in my head, singing, then silent, not as in desertion, but as when the victim suddenly knows his torturer's face from before, somewhere, and in knowing is for a moment distracted, has stopped struggling, and the heart gives in. Carl Phillips. We walk through a calligraphy of hats, slicing off foreheads, ace-deuce, cocked, they slant, razor-sharp, clean through imagination, our spirits knee-dip in what we have forgotten. Quincy Troop. Sometimes I would seek laughter in a rock. The turn of a lizard in shadow was gorgeous. Populations and gorgons moved in the clouds. A sudden alto phrase came out of a brick. Moments in the road spoke to me. Afa Michael Weaver. So because we have a large panel, questions will be directed to several members of the panel at a time. And you may answer how you see fit. Yeah? The first question is for Elizabeth, Cornelius, and Carl. What is the criteria for being a contemporary African American poet? And what would you say are his or her responsibilities? While they're thinking, please turn your cell phones off. Thanks.
Well, I'll start with that trick question. The easiest way to start is with Langston, which a good rule of thumb for just about anything. And the Negro Writer in the Racial Mountain, 1925. If we have to be free within ourselves, he says to other black writers. He says, if white folks are pleased, fine. If they are not, that's fine too. If black folks are pleased, fine. If they are not, that's fine too. We stand atop the racial mountain, free within ourselves. And I think those are very enduring and useful words that take us back to what I think it means to be a poet. That is to say, to listen to strange music that emanates from within, even if it has all kinds of cultural underpinnings and resonances. It's nonetheless individual music. In listening to those brilliant choices that Dante made from each of us, I thought such brilliant choices. I'm jealous of each and every line, and none of us could write each other's lines and be speaking our true selves and be singing our own true songs. He captured a bit of what is distinct about each of our voices, something that's very hard to pin down sometimes. Now, that said, I also think that it is very nice when we undertake the responsibilities of citizenship. What does that mean for Black poets? Well, it can mean a lot of different things, but for me personally, it begins with the general kinds of responsibilities of citizenship, which is to say that even in your very small communities, to speak truth to power the best you can, beginning with your family and moving outwards, and that from that, an ethos of generosity, I think means sometimes that in the poetry world, where sometimes the rewards are small or elusive, where it can take a long and difficult time to build a career, that an ethos of generosity would say that you would help other poets in some kind of way. So that's the beginnings of a meditation on that. That's not meant to be prescriptive, but is meant to be a little bit prescriptive, actually.
Well, I'm interested in the quotes as well that you selected, Dante, because to me, listening to them, it confirms that there isn't necessarily a particular definition of African American poetry. And that's what I've found most refreshing, something that seems to have changed in the last, say, 30 years. It seemed to me that each of those quotes was an expression of love of language, an expression of something honest from each individual writer. I guess I think that the obligation is to write the poems you must write. And presumably, those are going to speak and resonate with human beings. That, to me, is when I feel I've succeeded. That the poems resonate with a variety of types of human beings, different genders, different races, different sexual orientation. And it doesn't mean that those identity markers are not relevant, but I find they're part of the lens work, I guess, through which I see the world, but they're not the only way that I see the world. So that's my contribution to the meditation.
I don't know if I'll have anything more to add to this, other than to maybe just say that I do have a sense of, well, maybe a way of putting this is that, you know, I've changed a lot in my position over the 54 years I've been here on this planet, you know, and I'm sort of like a result of a lot of different histories and a lot of different you know, languages and a lot of different you know, families that I've been in over the years, and you know, I do like the idea that the poet should have some sort of consciousness about the world that he or she lives in, and that should permeate the poetry on some level. On the other hand, you know, I also, having gone through Cave Canem, I'm sort of like thrilled by the idea that there are no definitions, right? That in a sense, you know, as Carl was pointing out, you know, it's what we say to one another. It's what we allow each other to know about ourselves, about our lives, that pushes the boundary and the definition of what African American poetry can be. I mean, that's what I've seen in my life, right? You know, and when we get together at Cave Canem, there's proof of that. You know, you have different groups from different sensibilities, different political stances, different sexualities. I mean, all in one place talking to one another, and when that happens, you know, it influences other people to say, look, yeah, that's in that room too, right? That's African American. That's you, but it's also African American poetry as well. You know, I go from, I guess from a younger point of view, I always thought that anything that an African American poet writes is African American poetry. You know, just by definition, rather, you know, and you have this idea of what that means. There's a whole range of definitions of what that means. That's what I've learned over the years. But we influence and we talk to one another and we give ourselves the strength and permission to push ourselves to find those other corners that necessarily aren't there or necessarily always heard. Major gave me a great example of that. You know, we were sitting around before the event started, and Major was telling me how much my second book was such an influence to him. Fixing to the Last Dance craze was really floors me. But that's part of the tradition too. You know, we talk to one another. You know, and I was telling Major how much that influenced, what a similar thrill it was for me to find a copy of Yusef's Copacetic in a bookstore in Virginia. All right, it was suddenly I was a young poet and I was looking for other poets or other ways, and suddenly there was this African American man published by Wesleyan University with this incredible book. All right, and it was an affirmation, and it was also a recognition, and it was something that said, you know, you need to, that language is okay, you can push it, keep going, you know, somebody else is out there too. And I think that's also part of it. But I you know, the definition is changing, it's evolving. We can push, you know, and it's up to us to decide what that definition is. It isn't something that, I guess really the problem I have with the question is that it sort of infers that somebody else is making the definition, right? That there is a definition out there that's set. And I don't agree with that. I really think that it's an ongoing thing. It's a live thing that changes, and we all influence that definition. If that's a duty, then I think that might be our duty.
Right. The next question is for Toy, Yusef, and Quincy. How would you say that public programs, I guess similar to this one, that continue to mark African American artistic production as something other than the larger society, affect what is being composed by African American poets, and how do you think it is being received by the general reading public?
Are we in alphabetical order or what?
No, you can go. You can start it off, Quincy. If you
Go for it, Quincy.
Okay. First of all, I think that these programs are useful and are good when everybody can come together and people who have not been together before and hear each other read and talk and communicate across space. That, you know, and I think that's good. I've never thought of myself as an other. Never. I've never thought of myself as that. My mother, who will be 91 this year, always told me I could do whatever I wanted. And I felt I grew up like that. I think that writing, if somebody wants to identify what I do as other, that's their problem. It doesn't have anything to do with me, you know. I write from a tradition of where I come from, a place, geography. I happen to have grown up in different countries in the United States. My father was a great baseball player, and he played all over Mexico and Cuba and Puerto Rico, and I grew up in those cultures and heard all that stuff. And so I have a kind of interesting way of looking at language. And so that's where I come from, basically, from that place. And having grown up in St. Louis, which is a blues town, and grew up in the Baptist church, and grew up in a family that was a great family. I come from there too, also. So I think it's very interesting where we all come from, and I think that's very important where we all come from, and whatever that space that we occupy, and where our space is. And I think it's all valid. I believe in this and that. And I think that's very important for me. I don't know about others. Some people believe in just that, you know, or this. And I believe in this and that. And people can do what they want. And I kind of judge a poem if it's good or not, or if a piece of music is good or great, or a piece of art is great. And so for me, to go back and circle back a little bit, I think that these gatherings are very useful. I think they're useful if they're interracial. I think they're useful if they're like this. If something heavy happens there, that's good. Any place something good is contributed. But as I said before, if somebody thinks of somebody as other, then that happens to be their problem. If they think of me as an other and what I do, that doesn't have anything to do with me, and I can't control that.
Well, I think the key word is dialogue. I don't think I would be writing if I was not really searching for a dialogue, and sometimes that dialogue is very internal. At least it begins internally and it reaches outside. And it has to have a certain truth based on observation, based on experiences and what have you, based on the scope of the imagination. I think Phyllis Wheatley, it's interesting to even mention Phyllis Wheatley in this town, you know, because she wrote a very interesting poem called On Imagination, and that particular poem has really influenced me in a sense because here she is around the 1770s. She's a servant, and she has the audacity to present herself as a writer, as a thinker, you know. So as long as the poem challenges, I define poetry as confrontation and celebration. The idea of the African-American poet started off with a kind of service literature. And basically that service literature had to do with defining the essence of blackness. I think it was Robert Hayden who really began to argue against that definition, that restrictive definition as such. And I remember, well, in 1968, at FIS, there was a dialogue going on, and I don't know if it was a similar room as this, but I surmise that that was the case, where Hayden had to defend basically his individuality. The whole culture of the poem, Hayden embraced and celebrated. So I don't like the idea of drawing these little lines in the dirt, because poetry is supposed to bring us together, at least. It's the only art that we have left that can really create a bridge and bring us together. To dare to have that same kind of audacity that Phyllis Wheatley had in the 1770s here in Boston. I just want to keep surprising myself. That's the only thing, for the poet, that's the real allegiance, to keep surprising him or herself. That's it.
Dante, I wrote something, and it's sort of something that I want to say.
Sure. Go ahead.
I just wanted to talk a bit about the importance of community, and especially about Cave Canem and where it came from, and I think that relates to this question. Toni Morrison said that she writes the novels that she needs to read. I could say that I helped to make the communities that I needed to be a part of. Do the things you love, and what I love more than anything is to be present when poems are born. I learned as I was teaching in the Poets in the School program that writing poetry really does change people's lives. I'd go to classrooms for 1 hour a day for 4 days. I worked with thousands of children. Several years later, I went back to children I had worked with years before, and I found that some children's lives had changed after they wrote one poem. One girl, Desiree Titmus, who had never spoken before and had hidden under her teacher's desk till 4th grade, was on her way to the room for the retarded children when she wrote, "I, the mountain, am big. In the morning, people climb me with rope and pick and a camping pack. In the evening, my mountain gets purple. Then it is dark." with every word spelled correctly. Her mother said she had gone on to be the class clown and in high school class president and then on to college. Writing was a power that I knew no one could take away, yet as a Black poet, I was discouraged. I had read no Black poets in grade school, high school, college, or grad school. A professor, when I had asked, said, "We don't go down that low." Perhaps I wasn't entitled to this high art. They say a poet writes in solitude and isolation. Under such circumstances, I could not have survived as a writer without the support of a community. Cave Canem began as a community. It began with Cornelius, his wife Sarah Micklem, and me. It began in trust and friendship. If you think about negative capability, the poet opens up a space for something to happen. Cave Canem is like that, a space we opened up for something to happen, and it did happen. We all wanted this community so badly that it almost had to happen. My friend, the priest, Father Francis Gargani, who let us use the monastery on the Hudson, Sarah, Cornelius, then Elizabeth and Afa, who joined us as first-year faculty without a salary. The first night when we sat in a circle and were astounded by the sight, a circle of African American poets. Many of us had never experienced anything like it. Cornelius and I walked around saying, "Who's in charge here?" The circle we sit in on the first night indicates many things. It is a metaphor. In a circle, we face each other, confront each other. It's a way of calling us all to the seriousness of our work. In the circle, we mirror each other. So when one of us feels broken and unable, we look across and see our power and beauty reflected in someone else. In a circle, we see that each is an important part. The circle depends on it. Let's say you might have been able to wish for a life before you were born. I couldn't have wished for anything like this. This gift was so far from my sense of possibilities that a part of me is still catching up to the fact of it happening. Yet, somehow, the wish was there. There's nothing I could have asked for more than to be present to see this today, this panel today, which to me represents a great birthing of American poetry.
Thank you, Troy, for that. I guess I'm glad you bring up Cave Canem, which is sort of blossoming into a wonderful thing since its inception, but it has not done so without controversy. So I guess this question is not only directed to Toy and Cornelius, who are the founders, but also to Major and Dawn, who have both been Cave Canem Fellows. How are efforts by organizations like the Hurston Wright Foundation or Cave Canem, for example, affecting the state of African American poetry today? And also, what is the validity of criticism that pits these organizations as, quote, newer, darker bastions of exclusivity? Go ahead, George.
I have no idea. I don't know what, what effect those kinds of organizations might have on, in the sense of them being controversial. But, what I know is that, organizations like Cave Canem, I'm much less familiar with the other organizations, kind of provide this space for a real diversity of African American poets to get together and work. And I think the importance of them, is related to that diversity. So that, one of the kinds of, points of contention that I have with a phrase like African American poetry singular is that it's indeed singular and that it should be multiple, because there are so many different identities within, both the African diaspora, whether it be, so that it's not, just American. So there's a conversation, I think, across, different kind of, national identities when it comes to the African diaspora. But also, even within the kind of particular framework of African American poetry, that there is a diversity of poetries and a diversity of aesthetics within that, within that, underneath that umbrella. And so, I think that it can only be good that there are, several organizations, working to nurture African American artists of all sorts, and that in that nurturing we kind of begin, I hope, to have a different kind of conversation about what it means to be of African descent and be an artist, so that we begin to engage more critically that notion of diversity.
I'm thinking here of, and it's been a while since I read it, but my son just told me he's reading Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, which is fantastic, because I didn't read that book until I was in college, and he's 10th grade. But there's and correct me if I'm wrong, help me out, y'all. It's been a while, but in thinking about your question, I was thinking about the main character in Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, who, if you'll recall, has a letter that he's been carrying around with him the whole time, and he finally opens it at the end. And I think it's maybe not verbatim, but pretty much, keep this black boy running. That's the note, right? And it was given to him by the president of the Historical Black College, black leader, of which Ellison, having gone to Tuskegee, kind of based that character on Booker T. Washington, which was to say at that time that Booker T. Washington wielded a great deal of power at the end of the 19th century, going into the 20th century, and pretty much, determined the fate of lives. And this was supposed to be a letter that he sent, that he gave over to potential employers. How is that relevant? I don't think Cave Canem should, in thinking about criticism, it should not be the only place in which people discover black poetry. It shouldn't become a vetting system of sorts. I'm surprised, I think it's wonderful, in which I'm in meetings for prizes and juries, and an applicant will come up, and 9 times out of 10, if they've been to Cave Canem, they will note it, and other non-black people on the committee will go, oh, Cave Canem, this is a former fellow, and it becomes this kind of card, which I think is to some extent fantastic. But I also think about those folks who are writing poetry that did not attend Cave Canem. That said, thinking about how it has impacted the landscape of American poetry, undeniable. And I think history will mark this particular moment as important, and will mark the vision of Toy Derricott and Cornelius Eady and the Micklums as having done an enormous service to American literature. That said as well, it's also not new. There have always been African American writing groups and collectives over the years that regrettably have been organized out of necessity, knowing that the radar would not, pretty much following Toy's thesis, she needed to create the communities that she needed in order to write. And Afro-Americans have continued and have always done that. I think it says something to the times in which we're living, to the fact that such organization can be recognized nearly globally, definitely nationally, but nearly globally. Stop me if I go on too long, because I'll continue.
Fine.
But I think instinctively why we're living at a moment in which African American poetry, particularly this moment, thank you, Vida, thank you, Allison, Alice, Quinn, thank you. Because I think instinctively we know that if we're going to gauge freedom in this country, if we're going to gauge how successful we've become as a democracy, we have to look at the art and literature of those on the margins. So instinctively, we're all here, we're all gathered, and instinctively there is such a thing as Afro-American art and Afro-American literature, because we know that it's the art that emerges from such spaces that give those values their credence and their worth. And to put it plain, we enlarge it. You know, right now I'm reading the literature of the Aborigines in Australia. I'm reading the literature of the Iraqis, mainly because I know that the mainstream press is not going to give me the full human story. And the fact that it's going to be those individual lives, those individual voices testifying to their own lives, that's going to give me the ultimate picture that I need to feel like I'm human and informed about what's going on in the world.
Tora Cornelius, do you have anything to add?
I was just thinking about being in a safe space where you don't have to write about being black, and you don't have to not write about being black, you know. And I was also thinking about Cave Canem as being so much about not Cornelius and Sarah and Carol and me. It's almost like we found a door and just opened and just were at the door, and suddenly it was like it was just that moment in time where people wanted this. And I can think of people in the lounge all night, 7 nights up, helping each other write poems. You know, I'd always thought you go into your room and write by yourself, and you know, and these were people who were all different styles, you know, all different kinds of voices and being stimulated. And I think that's one of the fortunate things, that people are fortunate, because Cave Canem doesn't have many, you know, we don't have infinite money. So there are only a certain number of spaces every year, and there are many applicants. And it is terrifying and hard to make decisions. And of course, we try to keep a diversity of styles. But what it means is there's room, there's a time for all of us to do this kind of work, because there is so much need and desire for this to happen.
Can I say something?
Yeah, please,
John?
go ahead.
I'm sitting here thinking about the impact of Dr. King on all of us in terms of poetry, and the fact that the end of segregation as we knew it at that time, and the opening of American society and opportunity, and also the last big surge in the migration from the South to the North brought very poor people to the cities, so that now we have a whole new black middle class. And that has been an opening of space for people who have wanted to write, specifically us. And so that has been an influence. And insofar as controlling forces, thinking about Booker T. Washington, and of course his nemesis Du Bois, but they were not in themselves a full range of resistance to oppression in this country. There were other factors, and I think it's important to contextualize these things. And looking at the contemporary state of African American poetry, if we contextualize it more fully, I came to BU first in 1995 to read for the Darkroom Collective. And I believe that poster that everyone signed is here in the archive now. And in terms of relative numbers, for the small size of the Darkroom Collective, it has had a larger impact, relatively speaking, if you're looking at numbers, than Cave Canem. So I think, and the influence of those people who have achieved a high-profile status in American literature is worth noting. So it's not just Cave Canem, it's important to see the whole context of this. And I think this is just human behavior, you know. And also in 1985, when I went to Brown, the MFA programs were in an earlier stage. They had not experienced the explosion that we've seen in the last 20 years or so. And so MFA programs are everywhere now. And the Darkroom Collective and Cave Canem and other smaller groups that I can't think of at the moment, but there's also a group that met someplace close to Cave Canem. But all of these groups have grown in alongside the growth of the MFA phenomenon in this country. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. And also that, you know, it's a great thing. I'm the first Cave Canem elder, so my job is to sort of be the bad dog in the yard, but and protect the house, you know, and so I'm barking, you know. So Cave Canem is a wonderful thing, and it's only human nature that when you produce something like this, it generates influence. But comparatively speaking, those small number of darkroom people, for example, when they were profiled on the cover of the New Yorker, that was a big deal. Right? And so you have to keep all of this in context, I think, and it's good for all of us. And I've talked to a number of people. Major's my mentee, you know, I'm Major's mentor, and that should be publicly known. And I have a few others, you know, who claim me. And I tell them, I say, you guys are doing beautifully. You know, when I was your age, it wasn't like that. When Cornelius and I came through, it wasn't like that, Cornelius, you know. And Sonia struggled by herself, you know, and so it's these things, you know, and so I think it's important to see all of this. And it's just, I mean, there are people who have endowed chairs, and they're not even 40 years old. It's like, my goodness, you know. And so I was an adjunct in New York City, riding number 2 train from Brooklyn back, you know, trying to keep my lunch money. And so, and this is progress. And also I want to say that, you know, it's also a measure. Langston Hughes, I had the good fortune of studying with Langston Hughes' secretary. God bless him, he's gone now, Professor George Houston Bass. And working with him, and I came to understand Langston Hughes was middle class. And Langston Hughes would go out in the evening with Mr. Professor Bass, and they would walk through Harlem, and they would observe. And they would come back into the house, and Mr. Hughes would say, well, George, what did you see? And George would say, well, this is what I saw, Mr. Hughes. And he said, well, that's interesting, but let me tell you what I saw. Right? And so they did this as a kind of ritual, you know, observing. Langston Hughes observed, and he protected the culture in his own way. And I think that had it not been for his life dedicated to the art, and you can say what you like about critical assessment, I don't like, that's the critic's job, not my job. But he covered all the genres, and had he not done that, I would not have thought it possible to be the person I thought I was, namely a poet. So, in reading, you know, I was reading about Dr. King last night, and I was meeting August Meyer's assessment of him in this collection that I have. And he was talking about the militant conservative and just how wise and fortunate in many ways Dr. King was. But there is something about this careful push toward freedom for African American poets. And also, I actually like to say we have the option of not being one, right? So we can opt out of it now, and that's where we are now. You don't have to be in that if you don't want to. But some people, I don't choose to opt. I don't see a reason to opt out, but that is an option. The consistent push, the consistent agitation, the consistent resistance to racially based oppression in this country has always given African American poets the space in which to work, and that space is bigger now because of Dr. King.
Oh, that's real quick. You know, I think we should also talk about the Frederick Douglass Creative Arts Center in New York that was there for 30 years. I've been there, and I was a part of that from the beginning. And I see like Nikki and Sonia Yusef, and I first met Yusef when he did the readings there. So we had all kind of readings for 25 years. And I mean, I'm not saying this to say this bad, but I think we got to have to put all of this in some kind of perspective. As he said, the historian, we have to put all of this in some kind of perspective, how everything comes about. You know, the Black Roots Festival for like 30 years had these great Toni Morrison read The Beloved. First time she read Beloved was at the Black Roots Festival and that we put on. You know, she read it for an hour where everybody was like, oh, reading for an hour, damn. You know what I mean? So, so that's, I just wanted to say that's very important to understand, especially for people who don't know, you know, and young people who don't know about this. And I think Cave Canon is great, but I think there's things that have come before, and I think we have to put all of that in some kind of perspective in a way, you know? I think we have to do that.
Thank you, Quincy. And I think there'll be many, many things that come afterwards, and I hope that that's what panels like this will generate. The next question is directed towards Elizabeth, Yusef, and Carl, though you all may feel free to answer. The novelist Martha Southgate suggests that African Americans are the beneficiaries of generations of struggle, and she, because of this fact, is free to focus on character and craft, not social issues when she writes. The question is, how does socio-political consciousness manifest in your poetry, if you feel it does at all?
Okay, maybe I should jump in. I'm probably the only one sitting here who actually attended segregated school. No.
Two more down here.
Okay.
Well, he meant sitting on the panel here, not in the audience.
Baltimore.
Not true.
I think he meant sitting at the table.
I was one of the kids on the bus.
And I was thinking about as we were discussing this. You know, I came in contact with African American poetry through a segregated system. Matter of fact, a lot of emphasis is placed on certain African American poets, starting with Phyllis Wheatley, James Weldon Johnson. Paul Ernst Dunbar was always there. Alice Spencer, who we don't really talk about that much, do we? Right. As of course, as well as Langston Hughes. So, in a certain sense, there was a certain facilitation of black literature and expression within the context of oppression, out of a kind of severe necessity. As far as having the freedom of the privilege to write about those things, okay. First of all, I believe this. There isn't any topic that's taboo. But it does have to have a system of aesthetics, love, beauty, and truth. The poet always finds a way to say what he or she has to say with a measure of beauty, a measure of discovery. I cannot divide one from the other. You know, when it comes to writing a poem that's forthright, that engages my perspective, who I am, what I'm willing to risk dreaming, okay? It has to surprise me. It has to remind me why I do what I do. I was influenced in a way by Baldwin. 14, I came in a segregated little one-room library. I came across Baldwin, and it was Baldwin's photograph, I think, what really influenced me, you know. And I said, oh gosh, black writer I didn't say identify with at that time, but in retrospect, I said, yes, it was that kind of very forthright identification. And in a way, Baldwin gave me, created the privilege, in a way, just through my own imagination and engagement, to do what I do. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing it. So sometimes it's in the context of a very restrictive community, in a way that a certain kind of blossoming, a certain kind of freedom takes shape, a daring.
Well, I think, I mean, the question is, to what degree does this kind of consciousness play into our work?
Or if you see it happening in your work.
I mean, it seems to me, what Yusuf says about writing, it seems to me, I don't know many poets who sit down and say, well, I have this particular kind of consciousness that I want to express. I think it's that we're moved to write something, and it comes out and then gets categorized by other people sometimes. So I don't sit there and think of myself writing a specifically African-American poem or a gay poem. It's sort of surprising to me when then someone will come up and ask a question that focuses on that. Not because it's not there, but because that wasn't something I was conscious of while writing. Yusuf mentioned Baldwin. The two books of Baldwin's that really had a huge influence on me are Another Country and Giovanni's Room. And I remember with Giovanni's Room, at one point thinking, what color are these people? Because it never had really been stated, and yet I knew that this was written by a black writer, and I thought, this is really odd. And it also really wasn't clear because someone had told me it's a gay book, but it really wasn't. It became more and more nebulous, and in Another Country, all races seemed to be in play, and there were all these combinations. It became, maybe some people were gay, maybe straight, maybe just sleeping around in a sort of random way. You know, because somebody was at the jazz club or something. And I found this refreshing. I thought, you know, here is an African-American writer, but he's using everything he has and using it when he needs to, when he has to. So I thought it was very brave that he could write so many different types of novels. And I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to write poems that don't disavow any of the different elements that are part of me, but I don't want them to sort of restrict me and make me, I don't want to feel as if now I must always write about this or that in this particular way or that way. So sure, there's a political or social consciousness, but I feel that can sometimes get in the way of writing the essential poems. And then I think it's for somebody else to decide, if they must, what kind of a poem it is we're writing, apparently, say they.
Well, and just briefly, you know, Yusuf's words really said so much. Why I'm willing to risk dreaming, what I'm willing to risk dreaming is something that really stayed with me. And I think, you know, the socio-political is an adjective I think is almost always delimiting, you know, and I think instead we live in the world. You know, we live in the world and there's a whole lot in the world. And the challenges of the poet are always, as Yusuf said, to be able to see how we make art of that which we are in the midst of. And sometimes we are in the midst of, you know, I live a great deal in my mind and in books, and that's my day-to-day socio-political reality quite often. So that's real. That's material. That's living. you know, have we written poems with Barack Obama in it yet? Who's going to edit that? Millions of anthologies. But the point is, I mean, in all seriousness, actually, if I may, I mean, it's a very, very, very extraordinary moment, I would say, not just for the country, but I will generalize and say for Black people. I measure that by saying that if I have this many conversations with African American elders who are critical, yes, but also stirred and moved and amazed in ways that they haven't thought they would be for a very long time. That's one of the ways that I measure the extraordinariness of this moment, that I really don't think, I don't know anybody who quite imagined it would all be playing out like this. And certainly everybody I know is investing hours and hours and hours and hours of time on television and on the blogs and, you know, talking. So the point is, we're living in the midst of that. Will some of those traces make their ways into poems? Will they, you know, the wonderful Frank O'Hara poem, Orange, where he talks about going into the artist's studio and there's the bowl of orange and he's painting oranges and then there's sardines in the painting. And the point is that what the artist says the painting is going to be about ends up not being literally visible in the painting, but nonetheless, it's part of the way that the artist got to the painting, that very quotidian detail of oranges or of sardines. Forgive me for not getting the poem exactly right. So, you know, we live in the world and we have our poetic filters that process. And I think sometimes the overdetermined fear of the socio-political makes us leave out the very stuff that is our material.
You know, the idea of what that definition means, I think, is part of the problem. I'm sorry, the idea of what that definition means is part of the problem. I mean, for an African American writer, I mean, you know, the thing that always astonishes me is that how little it takes these days for someone to think that you're writing political, when you're simply just writing an experience, right? Simply because it's attached to an African American voice, right? And I'm also kind of concerned about the idea that, again, this question, the way it's posed, is if there's some sort of negative connection to the idea of being socially, you know, political. I mean, you know, it depends on what you write, right? It depends on, I mean, it's sort of set up as kind of this like disparaging sort of thing. Oh no, they're political, you know, I mean, or they're talking about oppression or, you know, how that actually works in the world, you know. That's not a bad thing to write about. I mean, it really isn't. It's something you shouldn't apologize for. So it isn't writing it per se. It's how you write it. I guess what we're really talking about is it too polemic? Is it too, you know, strident? That's what we're talking about. That bad kind of writing. But everybody does that, you know. It isn't, you know, just to totally the you know, the regime of in our own, you know, just only an African American voice. But I think, again, one of the things I've learned about Cave Canem is that the way I've learned how other people see African American writing, right, has been a real revelation to me. Because I'll give you, everybody, when they think of African American poetry, they just think. That's what they think, right? Very limiting, you know, just that. And I think one of the surprises about this is that people sometimes, oh my God, it's layered, it's talking about this. It comes from your life. And our lives are complicated, you know? I mean, there's a lot of complications in that sense of who we are, and it isn't that we can't write about it. And I guess that idea of, you know, is I guess what she was saying, that she's now free not to write about that. Is that's the way I'm understanding that? Mm-hmm. Well, I don't believe her, number one. I mean, I don't believe. I don't know what world she's living in. But I mean, it's good if you can declare yourself within yourself that you're free from that. Fine, you know. But that doesn't mean you don't live in the world, right? And you know, but again, the idea is, I think it isn't a question of whether you should or should not write political, whatever that's supposed to mean. You know, but it's how well you write it, right? You know, the thing that is it true? Does it strike a chord? Does it make us think? Does it confront us in a way that we weren't thinking before? Does it move us? Does it connect us? You know, that's what we're really talking about here, right? And whether or not that becomes somebody's problem, because we're talking about things that are social, political, and, you know, how all intertwined we are and how messy that is. Well, that's too bad, you know. I mean, really. And that isn't my job to try to apologize for that. I don't think we should talk ourselves out of, you know, that.
Thank
as
you.
if it's a bad thing to do. It isn't. It isn't.
Thank you, Cornelius. We're running a little bit long, and I want to make sure there's time for questions from the audience. So if you have a question, you can begin to queue up. But I want to ask one more question before we move into that, and it's, again, about another sort of category of poetry. And in my work at Cave Canem and my sort of involvement in poetry at large, I think this is the most important question to emerging writers, and perhaps it's a symptom of sort of an urban environment, or me living in an urban environment, but I wonder if the same is true in other environments. So I'll just read this quote from Rita Dove. She says that performance poetry is mostly performance. It seeks the audience and tailors its expression to that end. That's more theater than poetry, and I'm here to find the poem, not the speech. The page can go to the stage, but the stage can rarely go to the page. The question is, does performance hinder the evolution of our poetry by perpetuating African Americans as performers in service to the larger society, or does it further the oral traditions that we have inherited from our ancestors? The question is primarily directed at Major, Dawn, and Afa, but I think you all might have something to say about it.
Well, I like to point out that, as far as I know, when Paul Laurence Dunbar read the poem of his A Negro Love Song, when he got to the refrain, "Jump back, honey, jump back," he actually jumped across the stage. Yeah. And William Wells Brown, when he read his play, sometimes from the pulpit, he did a one-man performance. And so I think performance has always been a part of African American poetry, and it's a part of poetry. Poetry is performance, and I like to say also that the poem on the page is a kind of composition, and the performance is the construction in your own consciousness, how you receive it, and so it's always active that way. And I would also like to say that this stage page thing has become a little bit of a sticky issue for some people, but with the more recent advent of quote-unquote performance poetry, let us not forget the last poets, but with the more recent advent, I think we've had a popularization of poetry for sure, and many fine poets who started in that venue have come quote-unquote to the page. And so I don't want to stir up what I think is and controversy that goes nowhere, but just simply say that there's always been performance. That's a requirement for poetry.
I'll add to that that the Watts Prophets, you mentioned the last poets, there was also the Watts Prophets. They're not too much talked about or written about these days, but they were over in LA doing good work as well. I'm happy you mentioned Dunbar because, those dialect poems that they were categorized was part of his book, Majors and Minors. And those dialect poems appeared in the minors section. Poems like Sympathy and other more contemplative poems that did not showcase the vernacular of the people, he put in the majors. I'm in agreement that poems do perform and how they reveal themselves orally in the world. I'm not in control of that. Maybe in a digital world in which everything is getting digitized, maybe I have more control than I expect. But there's been poems by some people on this panel, I felt like I can read them better than they read them. I do a great Yusef Kumayaka, Venus's Flytrap, But I think, as we grow and mature, and as the art grows and mature, these debates become facile and not important because, to some extent, really the voice of the poet is going to be the authoritative reading with, as I was saying, with digitization. But for me, I can tell a poem is good on the page because it's performing in other ways. It's not reliant on the body or the speaker. Yes, that's the ultimate incarnation, but when it's doing other sorts of things, that has me reflect and be human and think about language. And as a poet that I love talks about how it gets inside language, then I know that it's really doing an amazing job in my imagination and consciousness.
Along those notes, I think that it's kind of an artificial division between performance and what's on the page, because obviously poetry that's on the page performs or can perform, and when the body is involved, I feel like there's a different kind of engagement in language that, so you're kind of interpreting language for a kind of presentation in a public space, which I don't necessarily think is a bad thing. And I also think that there are, in this contemporary digital age, there are, other kinds of ways in which poetry can become multi-dimensional, in the sense that it is not just about language, the printed word on a page, but it can also be about the body and multiple bodies getting involved in presenting some kind of art, and other elements too when it comes to the digitization of language. And so I think that the question or the condemnation of performance poetry is almost, I don't know when Rita Dove made this statement, but
2006.
No, I was going to say it's kind of old, because there's so many different kinds of poetry happen. There's digital poetry that, and there's, other kinds of performance poetry that, is not, the traditional slam poetry, which I don't necessarily think is bad either. So I think that, the question is kind of hard to address, or the division is kind of hard to address, because there's, this kind of multiplicity of productions that involve, different ways of presenting the poem to audiences.
And I'd like to just say very quickly that I wish I could hear Sam Allen perform, and just say that Sam turned to 90 last year and is probably the last surviving member who actually participated in the Harlem Renaissance towards the end. Just wanted to say that. Wow. Sam is 90 now.
Nice. I thought I saw a question. I'm sorry, you said yeah.
No. I was wondering about that question because I don't think we've been really forthright, because I think we've probably all heard poetry that is only written for that moment of oral expression. And no way, don't care how you twist and turn, it's not going to survive on the page. No way. And if the poet who's performing is aware of that, then it's legitimate. Okay?
Well, it's funny you say that, Yusuf. I'm trying to write. Afad Weaver wrote, created a forum called The Bop, and I've been looking for song lyrics. And I was listening to a woman named Amel LaRue, who is the daughter of a wonderful dance critic named Brenda Dixon Gottschall. Wrote a song called Get Up. You know that song? Yeah. Get up, when you gonna get down? I was like, all right, that's gonna be no, you're down. I see you're down, but when you gonna get up? I was like, that'll be good in the poem. And I wrote it down, and it wasn't. I see you down, when you gonna get up? I see you down, when you gonna get up? And then I thought about it, I was like, oh, it's the beat. It's the music that's giving it great heft. So what we have to do is give those words heft on the page. That's what I meant earlier. Is you're inside the language and you're doing other kind of things that make the poem perform, then I don't have to worry about its oral presentation because I know I got it tight, as my son says, it's tight.
I just want to add one quick thing, which is, in some ways, I think for me, the page itself has become a kind of limitation, so that there are other kinds of poetry, particularly digital poetries, which give one more, which provide a different kind of possibility for what language might do, and the page can actually accommodate that. So I think there are, other ways of thinking about, it's not like poetry on the page is, the best thing ever and there's nothing that's ever going to live up to it. There are other ways of thinking about ways to engage with language and present them to audiences.
So at this time, we'll take some questions from the audience. Over here.
I grew up with poetry coming from Susan Sanchez and Nikki Giovanni back in the 60s, when these ladies wrote simple poetry. Over the years, I have gotten tired of poetry because it has gotten so difficult. It's like what I've read in the 60s is not the same poetry that I'm hearing today. And the thing about it is that I believe that whoever writes can do whatever they want with words. They do not have to be limited to a certain culture or the fist. We all grew up, I would assume, I grew up in a segregated school, and sharecropping. So if you want to go to segregating school, I can go all the way to sharecropping. So the thing about it is that another thing that I don't hear among black writers or people of letters is, especially black African Americans, is that no one ever seemed to mention the great writer and poetry and poet Pushkin, Alexander Pushkin, who was a black brother. But his grandfather was charcoal black, and he was the greatest writer in Russia. And no one among the African American writers ever speak of this man. You ask when
Sir,
we
do you have a question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, you ask when we're going to write about Barack. When we're going to write about Pushkin.
I've already done it.
That's my question.
Yes. He's already.
Yusuf's already done it.
He's already done it.
He's mentioned in one of my poems, Pushkin.
This is an organizational question from Mr. Ercott. When you started Cutting the Economy, and to agree, this is also a question from Mr. Troop about the Frederick Douglass Center down in New York. Over the years, say the last 30 years, let's cut it off like that, there have been organizations, universities have been supportive, but who have been some other helpful organizations that you can point to in some of the organizational challenges you've had? You said money doesn't grow on trees. So where has that help come from? And one last question, Ms. Martin, what's a good resource for learning about that digital poetry? Is there a website, or where would we go to find out more about that?
Toy, do you want to begin? Oh.
Did he ask?
Well, I assume it's both for Cornelius and me that you're asking that. Well, we're writing proposals all the time.
Yeah. Our director's sitting right over there. You want to talk to her about that part of it.
They did.
We did.
He did, and he did.
Yusuf
And I
has a
did too.
poem, an entire poem, I believe, and I've mentioned him. We haven't forgotten him. No.
And he did too.
He isn't really frozen. I know someone who's also writing a play on Pushkin.
Yeah. You'll get there.
What were you going to say about it? I want to talk about Frederick Douglass.
Yeah. I'm sorry, we lost
Okay.
that there.
Oh, all right. Oh, yeah, go on,
Yeah.
Quincy.
I just want to, because we got a limitation.
Okay, yeah, go on.
Go.
Since we, I the Frederick Douglass, when I moved to New York in 1972 to teach at City University, Community College, Fred Hudson, who is now dead.
Oh, he died.
Yeah, he died. Who was from the Bahamas, and came up and he started this workshop, which was based on the Watts Writers Workshop, which was in Los Angeles, California, which I was a part of in the 1960s. You know, the Watts Writers Workshop in Watts, California in 1966. And they moved it to New York. And you were asking about the money. The money was very difficult. Everybody scrimped and scraped and begged and borrowed to get this money so we could run these workshops. And just like everybody's doing now. And, you know, but we were new. And, you know, a lot of people, like people said, everybody thinks it's like this. And everybody kind of gets back a little bit when you see a lot of black people trying to raise money for writing. It was, you know, you get scared, you know, and we were doing these festivals and all that. But it was very difficult. It was just very, very difficult. But we persisted, and the Frederick Douglass Creative Arts Center is still there. It's still there in New York City, and they do the same thing, and they have the same difficulty of raising money. Only now, which is very good, because they've got some black Wall Street people, investment banker types, who are putting their money up. It's like you said, the doors open up, people make money, people get in the middle class, and these people want to help, and they give it. And so now it's getting more and more endowed. But when we were coming around, I know Fred Hudson and myself, we ran around all the time looking for money. Everybody was looking for money. And we were doing festivals trying to get money and everything else trying to get money. And it's very difficult. It's a very difficult thing.
One of the things I wanted to say about that is that before we started Cave Canem, I had written a couple proposals to a couple different schools for retreats, for summer retreat for African American writers, and it wasn't funded. And thank God it wasn't funded, because one of the things that we wanted to be very careful about was getting funding from places where there might be strings attached, because it was so important for us to try to do this from our own artistic point of view. And a lot of times when you get money from people, as you well know, you have to sort of balance things out. The other thing is that when Cornelius and Sarah and I first talked about it, and we decided to do this, you know, because I had asked for money before from schools, I said, well, where are we going to get the money from? And Sarah said, let's just do it out of our own pockets. And it made it sound so simple.
Right.
And, you know, it started out like that, just
Out of our pockets.
just, you know, one little step at a time. And it couldn't have happened unless all of us were working together and each person brought something that helped the other person realize what could happen.
Well, we were lucky enough in the sense that we were all at a certain point professionally where we actually could, you know, give up some money without going into the poorhouse, right? It didn't take a lot of money to get it started, but it really was important, as Toya was saying, that it wasn't attached to something else. We're lucky that way. We're also lucky in the sense that, of course, it was such a strange concept to a lot of people. I mean, I think that's why Toy got turned down, right? The idea of, you know, Negroes going out into the woods writing poetry is just like it's an abstract, man. You know,
It's
you know,
scary.
It's scary. I mean, it's like it really is. It's like, huh? You know, you want to do what? You know, it's either that or it's. And you want me to pay for it. Yeah, you want me to pay for that, right? Right? You know, and that's actually, you know, it was a real pain, but it's actually in a way it was very lucky because we were invisible for a good long while. Mm-hmm. And that invisibility really helped. It helped us to define what we wanted and how we wanted to do it, and it helped us grow in a way that I think was really, really productive. I mean, if we had opened large, if we'd found somebody to give us, you know, like $1 zillion, and, you know, we could have done it really well, I don't think it would have worked the same way, and I don't think it would have been as effective as it turned out to be. I think having a number of years where people weren't really paying attention to how we were growing and who was coming out of that workshop really helped it. You know, I mean, I think one of the things we were talking about earlier about Cave Canem, and I think part of the thing is that, you know, we're the workshop people are not paying attention to. Like everyone's saying, there's a lot of history. Alpha was talking about the Darkroom Collective in the New Yorker. Well, you know how insidious this gets. You know, who wrote the article? Who wrote the profile? Me. And, you know, so it was one of those things where basically it was a confluence of a lot of things happening at that time. But we're the ones that people seem to be paying attention to only because we emerged 10 years later with this slew of strong, incredible young writers that people weren't paying attention to. And suddenly there was something, and suddenly it was this common thread that people started putting together. There was this thing called Cave Canem, but I think it happened because a lot of things didn't happen, you know.
And I wanted to say very quickly that in Chicago, there's the ETA Creative Arts Foundation that was founded by Abner Joan Brown, and focusing on theater, but extending also to poetry and to fiction. And they have the Playwrights Discovery Development Initiative that I have been a part of since 1993, and had the opportunity to work with Woody King and Ron Milner, and Eleanor Traylor, and a number of giants in black theater from that period in history. And Abner Joan Brown maintains that small theater there on the South Side through sheer courage and persistence. And the PDI program had as its mission to establish itself as a think tank for the future of black theater. So we met consistently for about 7 years, and then a little bit on an irregular basis for 2 or 3 years after that. But the idea was to sit around and discuss the state of African American theater.
Thank you,
ETA
Alfred.
in Chicago.
We'll take.
Don't forget Wintergreen, black women writers, because that was a wonderful thing for black women writers to have a place to. And Nikki and Sonia know about this. And there's so many groups like that, but these were very important groups for me, thinking about this.
We'll take 2 more questions. We'll start over here.
Real quickly, firstly, I'd like to thank everyone on the panel. It's been a really great event, and as a student at Boston University, we really do appreciate you taking the time to come really visit us. The question I have is that so many times throughout the history of our nation, poetry has been the soothing voice during times of crisis. You just Virginia Tech most recently, and do you still feel the poet and the poetry that the poet presents and creates still has that vibrant place or that important place as a soothing factor in our pop culture, especially with so many now competing voices, so many competing mediums? Do you feel it's still just as strong?
Yes.
For everyone.
Yes, we do. Because
We
the
hope
thing is, poetry comes from, I think, something deeper than a lot of these newer media, and I think it reminds us not only that we experience joy, but more often poetry reminds us that we suffer and that we survive it, or that there's some kind of dignity in trying to survive it. I think that's why poems come up around these Virginia Tech types of episodes, incidents, because of that. They remind us of the joy and sort of weird, the kind of weird joy that comes from knowing we've survived something seemingly unsurvivable. And I think poetry still does that.
Yes, poetry stimulates reflection for the most part.
Yeah.
A poem is a distilled meditation, and that is something often that's lacking within the context of, should I go back there, performance poetry.
And as a student, thank you, Ms. Giovanni, for your words, too, at Virginia Tech. We really appreciate it.
The question here.
My question is about poetry and the veil of translation. I work in American Sign Language and English, and I've had the privilege to look at and actually work with performers of oral poetry and work that into American Sign Language. And frankly, sometimes it flops, sometimes it's right on. Sometimes as performance, it works on the page sometimes. When you try to transfer it to a stage or vice versa, it doesn't work. My question is, for any of you, have you worked with any of your pieces and translating it into any other language? And if so, what dynamically made it work that you know of? Just for my edification, so I can take that back with me into my work.
Yeah,
I just came from Nicaragua. There's a big international poetry festival there, and I think some of us go to these international poetry festivals all over the world. And I think that if your work is there and they translate it, and if they translate the true essence of the word, what Yusef was talking about, the whole idea of the imagination and the surprise, and also if it has some innovation and the music of it, then people, they can get into it. They can really, really get into it in these different places, especially where poetry has a long history. In the United States, we have a long history, but in places like Colombia and Mexico and Nicaragua, and Venezuela and Cuba, and other places where they have a long history of people reading poetry, and they love it. You have 200,000 people come to a festival in Colombia. You better get up there and do it. You better get up there and do it when you got 10,000 people in front of you, because they're not coming there for no ridiculous stuff. They come there to hear. And so I think it works. It does work. It does work. If the poem is there and it can get into the language, it can work. It can work all over the globe. All over the globe.
Right.
All over. I'm telling you.
Unfortunately, we're running a bit long, so we're going to have some words from Vida Palladino. Thanks, Vida.
I want to thank this panel, and you realize the important work that they do. I'm just glad you don't have to be African American to enjoy your poetry. That's all. But I want you to look at the exhibit cases in the back, because you will see some Langston Hughes in the corner, and you will see Nikki Giovanni's archive on exhibit, Sonia Sanchez, and Afa Michael Weaver on the end. So during the intermission, before the reading, please enjoy the exhibition, and we'll be coming back to hear all of them read at 6:30. So please come back, have a break, and thank you very much for coming. And thank you all.